Hi guys, tonight we begin a quiet journey into the life of a woman who danced her way into history, Mata Hari. She was a mystery wrapped in silk and secrets, a performer who became one of the most infamous spies of the First World War. This story will take you through her rise, her fall, and the quiet spaces in between, the moments when illusion met truth. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe, and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. She was born Margaretha Geertruida Zell in 1876 in the small Dutch town of Leeuwarden. Her father was a hat maker, a cheerful dreamer who told her she was destined for something extraordinary. Her mother, gentle and devout, kept the home filled with calm and routine. In her early childhood, Margaretha lived in comfort, surrounded by her father's affection and the luxury he loved to show off. But when she was 13, everything changed. Her father's business failed, her parents separated, and her mother died soon after. The world that once seemed soft and safe began to crumble. She was sent away to live with relatives, strangers really, and it was there, in that quiet displacement, that she began to understand how fragile security could be. In her late teens, she studied to become a kindergarten teacher, but the headmaster's inappropriate advances shattered her sense of trust. She left, humiliated and confused, realizing that the world expected her to be both obedient and silent. That realization stayed with her, the awareness of how much power could hide behind charm, beauty, or silence. Then came the ad in the newspaper. A Dutch army captain named Rudolf MacLeod was seeking a wife. He was twice her age, but he promised a life of travel and comfort in the Dutch East Indies. To Margaretha, it sounded like escape, a chance to step out of the grey streets of Holland and into a world of sun and colour. She wrote to him. They met, married quickly, and soon boarded a ship bound for Java. The island was a dream, fragrant, humid, alive with sound. But the dream turned dark. Rudolf was a heavy drinker, prone to violence, bitter from his own failures. Their marriage became a cage. Margaretha learned to wear calm like a costume, to hide her bruises beneath silk, to move through danger with a dancer's grace. She began to watch, quietly, how people revealed themselves when they thought no one was looking. On the island, she also discovered the world of local dance, the slow, hypnotic movements, the way stories were told through motion rather than words. She was fascinated. In those temple courtyards beneath the heavy tropical night, she began to imagine a new identity, one that could not be hurt, one that existed beyond pain. When the couple's children fell ill, tragedy struck again. One of them died from poisoning, possibly from a servant's revenge, though no one ever proved it. The loss broke her completely. She left Java soon after, returning to Europe with little more than her name and her sorrow. Rudolf stayed behind, angry and bitter. In Paris, she would become someone else entirely, but not yet. For now, she was simply Margaretha, sitting by the window of a cheap boarding house, watching the lights of the city flicker like distant stars, wondering what kind of woman she would have to become to survive it all. Paris at the dawn of the 20th century was a city that breathed temptation. The air itself seemed to hum with possibility. Cafes full of smoke and chatter, dancers glittering beneath golden light, carriages rolling over cobblestones like soft thunder. Margaretha arrived there with no money, no connections, and no plan beyond survival. She was 28, beautiful and invisible, one among thousands trying to make a life in a city that fed on dreams. She tried modelling, posing for painters who paid in francs and flattery. But it wasn't enough. She needed more, not just money, but meaning. One night she attended a gathering of artists and officers, a crowded salon where people drank champagne and spoke in whispers of art and scandal. When they asked who she was, she didn't answer right away. The pause was deliberate, theatrical. Then she smiled and said softly, Matahari. The name rolled off her tongue like a secret. In Malay, it meant eye of the day, the sun. It sounded exotic, mysterious, and for that moment she ceased to be a woman from Holland. She became a story. Her first performances were modest, private gatherings, small stages, curious audiences. She wore veils of gauze, golden jewellery, and the illusion of ancient ritual. Her dances were slow, ritualistic, suggestive yet controlled. She told the audience that each movement came from sacred Eastern traditions, though in truth, most of it came from her imagination. Paris adored it. The more she blurred the line between truth and invention, the more the world leaned closer to listen. Within a year, she was performing at the Guimet Museum, surrounded by relics of Asia, where scholars watched her like they were witnessing a living artifact. Critics wrote that she had resurrected the mysticism of the East. She didn't correct them. She simply smiled, knowing the power of mystery. Wealthy men sought her out. Generals, diplomats, princes. They gave her jewels and invitations, whispered promises and secrets over candlelight. She listened more than she spoke. Her beauty was not just in her body, but in her stillness, the calm she carried even when the world around her spun with noise. Behind the curtain, though, she was still the girl from Leeuwarden, lonely, cautious, aware that every glittering night could fade by morning. She learned languages, memorized faces, and stored details like treasures. She began to understand how information moved, not as letters or numbers, but as favours, glances, and trust. And somewhere inside her, a new kind of performance began to take shape, one that didn't take place on a stage. As Europe inched toward war, Matahari's fame made her both adored and watched. Her exoticism, once harmless entertainment, now carried the scent of danger. But she danced on, her eyes calm as ever, as if she already knew that illusion once created can never truly be undone. Fame came to Matahari like dawn breaking through a fog, first slowly, then all at once. By 1906, her name was whispered in the same breath as elegance and scandal. The Paris press adored her. They wrote of her as a living symbol of mystery, the embodiment of desire and danger. Every movement of her dance seemed to hint at something forbidden, something ancient and holy. She performed before counts, colonels, and even kings, and when the veils fell away, so did the boundaries between truth and imagination. She wasn't just entertaining them, she was mesmerizing them. Her story of being a temple dancer trained in the East gave her performances an air of reverence. She told journalists she had learned sacred dances from Hindu priestesses, that each motion had spiritual meaning. Few ever questioned her. They didn't want truth, they wanted enchantment, and Matahari understood that perfectly. She built her fame not on facts, but on faith, the kind of faith that beauty could make people believe anything. Yet, behind the silk and smoke, Margareta still lived in the shadows. She moved from hotel to hotel, spending faster than she earned, always chasing the next patron, the next engagement. Paris was generous to its stars, but cruel to those who faded. Her lovers, officers, diplomats, men with medals and secrets, drifted in and out of her life. They adored her, but rarely stayed. Loneliness became her quiet companion, a steady heartbeat beneath the applause. Still, she carried herself like royalty. She dined in the finest restaurants, rode in carriages with embroidered cushions, and was seen in jewels so bright they seemed to hum with light. People speculated endlessly about her origins. Some said she was the daughter of an Indian prince. Others believed she was a courtesan trained in the art of seduction by ancient priests. She let every rumour live. In a world obsessed with labels, she had learned the greatest power of all, to be unclassifiable. But as the decade turned and war began to whisper through Europe, the atmosphere around her started to shift. France and Germany looked at each other through a haze of suspicion, and those who travelled freely between nations drew unwanted eyes. Matahari, with her international lovers and her fluid charm, became a figure both fascinating and potentially dangerous. She still danced, in Berlin, in Vienna, in Madrid, dazzling audiences wherever she went. But after each performance, her life grew quieter, emptier. Her beauty, though undimmed, began to feel like a fragile mask she had to hold in place. By 1914, as the guns thundered and the world fractured, the stage lights dimmed. The theatres closed, the men went to war, and the applause that once surrounded her turned into silence. For the first time in years, Mata Hari stood without an audience, and in that stillness she felt something unfamiliar. The faint pull of fear and the echo of her own name, whispered not with admiration, but suspicion. The war changed everything, not just for nations, but for people like her. In 1914, when Europe tore itself apart, the stages that once adored Mata Hari went dark. Borders closed, and her lovers, many of them officers, vanished to the front. The lavish life of salons and soirees dissolved into whispers of espionage and betrayal. For a woman who had made her living on illusion, the world was now filled with the cruelest illusion of all, control. She returned to the Netherlands, which remained neutral, and for a time she tried to live quietly. But she was restless. Paris called to her like a ghost. The city was where she had lived most vividly, and without it she felt like a painting fading in a dark room. She began travelling again, crossing borders with ease thanks to her Dutch passport. To officials she was still a celebrity, a harmless entertainer. To others she was a curiosity. That curiosity soon became suspicion. At every port and station the question of loyalty grew sharper. Whose side was she on? She had lovers in both France and Germany, officers who trusted her with their secrets, men who thought her beauty was reason enough to forget the world outside their embrace. But Mata Hari listened. Always. It was second nature now, to observe, to remember, to translate emotion into understanding. In 1915 she met a German officer named Karl Krummer in The Hague. He admired her, flattered her, and finally offered her money, supposedly for her return to Paris, but with an unspoken favour attached. You could be useful, he hinted, to Germany. She accepted the money, though whether she ever intended to spy for them is still unclear. Perhaps she saw it as another performance, another role to play in a world that demanded masks. But that small transaction would later become the evidence that sealed her fate. When she returned to France, she was no longer greeted as the celebrated dancer. The mood of the city had changed. Every foreigner was suspect. The once welcoming salons were now filled with whispers of betrayal. Yet she still carried herself with poise, the same quiet elegance that had once made her invincible. She stayed in grand hotels, visited embassies, and met with men who still adored her, though now each conversation felt like walking through smoke. It was in Paris that she met Captain Georges Ledoux, the head of French counterintelligence. He had heard of Mata Hari's travels, her lovers, her connections, and saw in her both danger and opportunity. He invited her to his office, polite but calculating, and made her an offer: spy for France. It was a moment of quiet irony. She, who had built her life pretending to be something she wasn't, was now asked to make that pretense a weapon. Ledoux promised her safety, money, and a chance to serve the country she loved most. She hesitated, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. She had lived too many lives already. Still, she agreed. That decision would change everything. From that moment on, Mata Hari was no longer just a dancer or a mystery. She had become a pawn in a game far larger than any stage she had ever stood upon. A game where every smile could be a trap, and every whisper might mean death. The winter of 1916 wrapped Europe in grey. Snow fell over cities that no longer sang, and soldiers wrote home with trembling hands from the frozen trenches. Far away from the front, Mata Hari lived in a world of hotel corridors, train compartments, and waiting rooms heavy with cigarette smoke. She was now, at least on paper, an agent of France, though what that truly meant, even she didn't know. Captain Ledoux had given her a mission: travel to neutral Spain, charm German officers, and send back what she could learn. It sounded simple, even glamorous. But beneath the polished promises lay the invisible machinery of war, and it was about to grind her between its gears. In Madrid, she stayed at the luxurious Palace Hotel, her reputation preceding her like perfume. Diplomats and officers came to see her, partly from curiosity, partly from desire. She played her part flawlessly, polite, amused, listening more than she spoke. Among those drawn to her orbit was Major Arnold Kaller, a German intelligence officer with a taste for conversation. Over dinners and drinks he spoke of the war, of troop movements, of the weariness that haunted every soldier's face. Mata Hari remembered everything, later writing letters to her French contacts, convinced she was serving the cause of peace. But war does not reward innocence. Back in Paris, the intelligence world turned colder. Messages were intercepted, ciphers misread, loyalties blurred. Somewhere between Berlin and Madrid, a report emerged, sent by the Germans, naming their agent H21. The details matched her movements. The French decoded it, and the name Mata Hari began to flicker through their offices like a spark near dry paper. Some believed she had been double-crossed, others that she was simply careless. But the seed of doubt had been planted. She, meanwhile, moved through the days unaware of the storm building behind her. She wrote to Ledoux, asking for payment for her work, for recognition. Her letters were unanswered. To her it was all theatre, a dangerous play perhaps, but one she could still control. To the French, it was treachery and silk. In early 1917 she returned to Paris, hoping to clear her name and resume her dancing career. The war, though, had hardened everything. Paris was full of funerals and ration lines. People whispered of spies everywhere, in cafes, in train stations, even in theatres. Beauty itself had become suspicious. Mata Hari still dressed in furs, still moved with grace, but her eyes carried a quiet fatigue. She longed for rest, for someone to see her not as a fantasy, but as a woman who had tried, failed, and tried again to survive. The morning of February 13th came without warning. 2 policemen knocked on her hotel door at the Plaza Athénée. She opened it calmly, her robe tied neatly, her hair pinned up. "Mademoiselle," they said, "you're under arrest for espionage." For a moment she smiled, a small, weary smile, the kind an actress gives when the curtain falls before she's ready. Then she nodded and followed them out into the pale winter light. The city she had once conquered now watched her in silence, as the woman who had danced like sunlight was led away into shadow. The walls of Saint-Lazare prison were cold and bare, a far cry from the velvet curtains and candlelight Mata Hari once knew. When the cell door closed behind her, the sound seemed to echo through all the versions of herself she had ever been. The girl from Leeuwarden, the soldier's wife in Java, the goddess of Paris, the secret courier whispering promises to men in uniform. All of them were here with her now, watching silently in the dimness. Her arrest sent shockwaves through Paris. Newspapers that had once celebrated her beauty now turned her name into a weapon. Headlines shouted, "The spy dancer, the woman who betrayed France, Agent H21. For the public, she was no longer an entertainer. She was a symbol of deception, of danger, of everything that had gone wrong in a war that refused to end. It was easier to believe in her guilt than to face the senselessness of the battlefield. Inside her cell, she kept her dignity like armour. Guards would later say she never raised her voice, never cried. Each morning she brushed her hair, applied a little perfume if she could find it, and asked politely for coffee. To her interrogators, she remained composed, even when they pressed her with questions she couldn't possibly answer. She admitted to taking money from the Germans, yes, but not to betray France. "I am a courtesan," she told them, "not a spy." She claimed she accepted payment as she had from many men before, for affection, not treason. But words, like beauty, lose power when people decide what they want to believe. Captain Ledoux, the same man who had recruited her, now distanced himself. His reports were vague, sometimes contradictory. It seemed convenient for the French military to have a scapegoat, a foreign woman, already notorious, already easy to blame. The truth of her actions, lost among coded telegrams and rumours, no longer mattered. The war needed someone to hang its failures upon, and Mata Hari fit the shape perfectly. Her trial began in July 1917, in a small military courtroom in Paris. She wore a simple black dress and a veil, her face calm, her posture elegant. The prosecution painted her as a serpent, a woman who seduced officers, stole their secrets, and sold them to Germany. They called her greedy, manipulative, dangerous. The evidence, when examined closely, was paper-thin: intercepted messages, inconsistent witness statements, innuendo. But in that fevered time, proof mattered less than performance. The judges, all military men, looked at her as though she embodied everything mysterious and untrustworthy about femininity itself. She was foreign, she was independent, and worst of all, she was unafraid. That alone made her dangerous. When asked if she had anything to say in her defence, she answered quietly, "A courtesan, yes, but a traitor, never." The courtroom fell silent, but silence does not change history's appetite. After 2 days of testimony, she was found guilty. The sentence was death by firing squad. That night, alone in her cell, she wrote a few letters, one to her lawyer, one to her daughter. Her handwriting was steady. There was no anger, only resignation, and a strange, fragile grace. She had lived her life as an illusion, and now the illusion would end as it began, beautifully, tragically, and with eyes open. Dawn came quietly to Saint-Lazare on the morning of October 15, 1917. The air was still, and a thin mist hung over the courtyard where the soldiers waited. Inside her cell, Mata Hari was already awake. She had slept little, though she appeared calm. When the priest entered to offer last rites, she refused politely. "I am not afraid," she said simply, her voice steady. She asked instead for a mirror, a comb, and her gloves. Even at the end, she would not be seen undone. She dressed slowly, choosing her black hat with the broad brim, her dark coat, and the fine shoes she had worn for her last court appearance. She pinned a small flower to her lapel, a touch of colour against the grey of the morning. The guards who came for her were uneasy. They had escorted many prisoners before, but none who carried themselves quite like this. She smiled faintly at them as she stepped into the corridor, the sound of her heels sharp against the stone. The car that carried her to the military barracks rattled over the cobblestones. Paris was just beginning to wake, the city she had once owned, now indifferent to her passing. Through the fogged window she watched the streets drift by, bakeries lighting their ovens, soldiers on bicycles, a child holding a loaf of bread almost too big for him. She thought of her daughter, Jean, whom she had not seen in years. Somewhere, perhaps, she was also waking to another day, unaware that her mother's story was ending. At the barracks, 12 soldiers stood in formation. Their rifles gleamed with condensation, their faces blank beneath their caps. A small group of officers and reporters watched in silence. One of them noted later that the morning smelled faintly of wet leaves and tobacco. It was cold enough for breath to show. Mata Hari walked toward the post where she was to stand. She refused the blindfold offered to her. "Must I?" she asked. And when they told her no, she smiled again. She stood straight, hands at her sides, eyes open and calm. For a moment, she looked at each of the soldiers, as though memorizing them, not in judgment, but in understanding. A captain gave the order. The rifles lifted, their barrels catching the weak morning light. The command came in a single word and the air cracked. When the smoke cleared, she was still upright for a heartbeat longer, then slowly fell, her skirt fluttering like a dark wing. A doctor stepped forward, checked for a pulse, and declared her dead. It was 6:15 a.m. No one came to claim the body. The newspapers that afternoon printed the story under headlines filled with irony and triumph. The spy who died without fear. Her remains were taken to a medical school for study, her belongings divided among officials. The woman who had once danced for kings now existed only as rumour and memory. Yet even as her name faded from the news, something lingered. People began to question the evidence, to wonder whether she had truly betrayed anyone at all. Over the years, documents surfaced, some contradicting the charges, others suggesting she had been trapped by circumstance. Historians would later argue that Mata Hari was guilty of naivety, not treason, that her greatest crime had been believing she could play a man's game and still remain free. Still, she had chosen her own ending, not in its outcome but in her poise, in the quiet refusal to kneel or beg. And in that final act of defiance, the legend of Mata Hari began, not as a spy, not as a dancer, but as a woman who dared to live entirely on her own terms, even in the face of death. After her death, Paris tried to forget her, but legends have a way of surviving even the silence of graves. The name Mata Hari drifted through the cafes once more, whispered by men who had once toasted her beauty, and by women who wondered if she had really been guilty. Some saw her as a warning, others as a symbol of independence. The truth was harder to define, too delicate to fit neatly into guilt or innocence. The newspapers had painted her as a master spy, a dangerous seductress who had brought armies to ruin. But when the dust of war settled, investigators began to notice how thin the proof had been. The coded messages that condemned her were vague, easily misinterpreted, and possibly even planted by the Germans to mislead the French. In one report, the agent H21 mentioned activities and meetings that never matched her actual travels. It was as though someone had created a phantom, a convenient fiction dressed in her name. Yet it didn't matter. France, still reeling from the bloodshed of the trenches, needed someone to blame. The government needed a show of strength, the army needed an example, and the people needed a story that made sense of their losses. A mysterious woman, foreign and beautiful, was the perfect answer. The myth became more important than the truth. In the years that followed, books and plays began to appear. Directors and writers reinvented her, sometimes as a traitor, sometimes as a heroine, sometimes as both. Each version borrowed a piece of her life and reshaped it. The silent film era adored her. Actresses in jewelled veils played her as an enchantress who wielded love like a weapon. The audience, hungry for glamour after years of grey hardship, watched in awe. They did not want the frightened woman who had stood in court. They wanted the legend who had danced for kings and fooled empires. Even in death she was performing. Her face appeared on postcards, in novels, in photographs reprinted so many times they began to blur. The line between the real woman and the invented one faded. To some, Mata Hari became a symbol of female power, a woman who dared to live outside the rules, punished for her freedom. To others, she was a cautionary tale, proof that beauty and ambition were dangerous in the wrong hands. Her daughter Jean grew up under a shadow she never asked for. She rarely spoke of her mother, though once, years later, she said quietly that she remembered her as gentle and kind. Jean lived a quiet life, far from the headlines. Perhaps that was her way of healing the wound history had left. Meanwhile, in archives and government offices, her name continued to linger. In 1985, nearly 70 years after her execution, French military documents were finally open to the public. What they revealed shocked many historians. There was still no solid evidence that Mata Hari had passed any military secrets to Germany. She had been watched, followed, accused, but never truly proven guilty. Some experts concluded that she was not a double agent, but rather a scapegoat, someone who had become too famous to ignore and too inconvenient to forgive. The myth, though, had already taken root in the world's imagination. Even as truth crept closer, the story people wanted to believe remained the same. A dancer who became a spy, a woman whose beauty was both her gift and her doom. And perhaps that was the last illusion Mata Hari ever created, one that even history itself could not resist. Decades passed, and the name Mata Hari refused to die. In smoky jazz clubs, in the new age of cinema, and in the whispers of writers chasing mystery, she was reborn again and again. Some called her the first femme fatale of the modern world, a woman who used charm as both shield and sword. Others saw her as a ghost from another century, haunting the border between myth and truth. Each retelling made her larger, brighter, and farther from the real Margrethe Zell, who had once walked through Paris with tired eyes and a secret heart. In the 1920s, as the world celebrated peace and tried to forget the horrors of the Great War, Paris rediscovered its appetite for beauty and intrigue. Cabarets reopened, stages glimmered, and dancers swayed under amber light. The story of Mata Hari became entertainment. Audiences cheered at plays where she seduced generals and betrayed nations. Her death, once a tragedy, was rewritten as spectacle. Few questioned whether she had ever truly spied. The illusion was easier to believe and more profitable. Her legend spread far beyond France. In Germany, she was portrayed as a misunderstood patriot. In America, she became an exotic temptress, a symbol of Europe's strange decadence. The first Hollywood films about her appeared in the 1930s, draped in glamour and shadows. Greta Garbo played her as a tragic goddess, doomed by love and destiny. Audiences wept, even as they knew the story was more fiction than fact. Garbo's Mata Hari became the one the world remembered. Soft, mysterious, untouchable. The real woman was buried beneath celluloid and myth. Meanwhile, history moved on. Another war came, greater and darker than the last. As new spies filled the headlines, double agents, resistance heroes and traitors, Mata Hari's story faded to the background, a relic of a simpler time when secrets could be whispered over champagne instead of decoded by machines. Yet even as the 20th century raced forward, her ghost lingered. Writers still invoked her name when speaking of seduction and secrecy, of beauty caught in the gears of power. In museums and private collections, her letters began to resurface, faded ink on fragile paper. In them she was not the seductress or the schemer the world imagined. She was a mother, a traveller, a woman longing for kindness. "I have always lived for love," she wrote once, perhaps too much. In another letter she admitted that she had made mistakes but insisted she was no traitor. Her words carried the quiet weight of someone who had already been judged, yet still wished to be understood. By the time the century neared its end, historians began to re-examine her life with fresh eyes. They saw in her story not a villain, but a mirror reflecting the fears of her era, the anxiety about women's independence, about sexuality, about control. Mata Hari had challenged those boundaries simply by existing as herself. She had stepped into a world ruled by men and dared to play by her own rules. For that, perhaps more than for any crime, she had been condemned. Today, her name still stirs curiosity. Her face, framed in soft sepia light, continues to appear in documentaries and exhibitions. And somewhere between all those retellings, between the dancer and the spy, the sinner and the saint, lies the truth of a woman who turned her life into art and whose final act became her immortality. As evening fell over Paris on the centennial of her death, people gathered quietly at the site of her execution. They left flowers, lilies, roses, white orchid, and stood in silence. A century later the legend still breathed, and though her story had been rewritten countless times, one feeling remained unchanged: wonder. The same wonder that once filled a theatre when a woman in silk stepped into the light and became, for a moment, the sun itself, the eye of the day. When historians look back on the story of Mata Hari, they see a portrait painted in contradictions. She was both powerful and powerless, adored and condemned, remembered and misunderstood. Her life unfolded at a moment when the world itself was changing, when women were beginning to demand more than silence, when nations were learning the cost of secrets, and when beauty could still be mistaken for betrayal. To understand her is to understand how myths are born, not from facts, but from fear and fascination. The early 20th century was not kind to women who wanted to live freely. Independence was seen as rebellion, sensuality as danger. In many ways, Mata Hari became a reflection of everything men feared about women who refused to stay within the lines. She was intelligent, worldly, and unapologetically aware of her effect on others. That, perhaps, was her first act of defiance. Long before she was accused of espionage, she had already challenged society's rules. She took lovers openly, lived alone, travelled without a chaperone, and spoke multiple languages. She earned her living not by marriage or inheritance, but by her ability to captivate. Her performances blurred the line between art and desire, transforming what was once forbidden into something divine. Yet beneath the performance she carried an ache, the loneliness of someone always watching herself from the outside, always aware that the world's admiration could vanish the moment she ceased to please. When war came, that same world turned its fascination into fear. Suddenly, her charm became suspect, her travel suspicious, her beauty a weapon. It was easier to call her a spy than to admit that power could belong to someone like her. In the courtroom, surrounded by men in uniform, she represented more than herself. She became a symbol, a warning to every woman who dared to live without permission. And yet, for all the tragedy of her fate, there was an undeniable poetry to her existence. She understood the theatre of life better than anyone. Every gesture, every glance, every silence was part of her performance. Even in her last moments, she chose grace over despair. That choice, to meet death without fear, became the truest expression of who she was. In the years that followed, artists, filmmakers, and writers continued to reinvent her. Each new version revealed as much about the time it was made as about the woman herself. In the 1950s, she became a symbol of Cold War paranoia. In the 1970s, of female liberation. Her image was moulded again and again, sometimes saint, sometimes siren, always a reflection of the questions society still asks about power, sexuality, and truth. Today, when her story is told, it carries a new tone, softer, more compassionate. People no longer see only the legend or the accusation, but the human being who lived between them, the dancer who tried to turn her pain into beauty, the mother who longed for peace, the woman who walked into history's harshest light and refused to bow her head. There is something eternal about her, not in her fame, but in her defiance. She lived as if she knew that life, like dance, is fleeting, and that the only way to truly possess it is to move boldly while the music lasts. And so, when we remember Mata Hari now, it is not as the spy the world condemned, nor the goddess the stage invented, but as something quieter, a soul who dreamed of freedom in a time that could not yet understand what freedom meant. The story of Mata Hari does not end at her death. In many ways, that was only the beginning of her afterlife. The mystery she left behind became a kind of open door, one through which generations would peer, searching for fragments of truth, beauty, or warning. Her image, etched into postcards and theatre posters, seemed to belong as much to fantasy as to history. People didn't want to let her go. They wanted to believe in her, not as a person, but as a symbol of something larger, something eternal. Over time, museums began to collect her photographs, her costumes, even her letters. A few of her delicate veils survived, shimmering fabric that once glowed under Parisian lights, now carefully preserved under glass. Visitors would stand before them, silent, imagining the woman who once made the world hold its breath. Some swore that the silk still carried her perfume, faint but distinct, like memory itself refusing to fade. In academic circles, her name sparked debate. Was she truly a spy, or simply a victim of politics and fear? Each historian found a different answer, shaped by the lens of their own era. Some described her as careless, too naive to understand the danger she was in. Others saw her as a scapegoat, the the perfect target for a government desperate to distract from military failures. What united them all was one shared truth. The evidence against her had never been conclusive. The coded telegrams used to condemn her had been vague, the supposed confessions twisted out of context. Even Captain Ledoux, the man who orchestrated her arrest, later admitted he wasn't certain of her guilt. But by then, it was too late. The machine of justice had already done its work. She had become a story the world wanted to tell, and stories once set in motion rarely stop for facts. As feminism rose through the 20th century, her legacy was reconsidered again. Writers began to see her not as a villain, but as a tragic figure caught in the crossfire of power and prejudice. She became a metaphor for every woman who'd been punished for her independence, for every life shaped by the judgments of men. Her trial was studied not just as a legal case, but as a cultural mirror. It revealed how societies fear what they cannot control, and how they often destroy what they secretly admire. In a sense, Mata Hari became what she had always wanted to be, unforgettable, but not for the reason she might have hoped. Her fame had begun as a performance, it ended as a myth. Yet within that myth, there remained a pulse of truth, the courage of a woman who lived by her own design, even when the world refused to understand her. Modern artists have continued to reinterpret her story. In paintings, she appears surrounded by smoke and gold, her eyes distant, her body half-shadow. In dance performances, she's reborn as a symbol of resilience, her movements echoing defiance rather than seduction. Even in music and literature, her name carries a rhythm, soft, mysterious, unfinished. More than a century later, she still defies categorization. Spy or scapegoat, saint or sinner. Perhaps she was none of these, and all of them. Perhaps her greatest act of espionage was stealing immortality from a world that sought to silence her. And as long as her story continues to be told, she remains, in some quiet way, alive, still dancing in the flicker between history and dream. Sometimes the past lingers not through evidence, but through emotion, through the faint sense that a story still has something left to say. Mata Hari's story carries that weight. When people speak her name now, it is not with accusation but curiosity. What kind of courage does it take for a woman to turn her pain into performance, to face death with her chin raised, to build herself out of fragments of imagination and survive, even in legend? Her story is not just about war or espionage, it is about transformation, the power and the price of becoming someone else. Before she was Mata Hari, Margrethe Zell was a girl who loved beauty in all its forms. She watched the world from behind glass, noticing details others missed. The curve of a hand, the shimmer of fabric in sunlight, the rhythm of footsteps on a cobblestone street. It was that eye for movement, that sense of life as choreography, that later shaped her stage persona. She didn't invent Mata Hari overnight. She built her piece by piece out of longing and imagination. The name became her armour, her prayer, her disguise. In Paris, she learned that survival required performance. The city adored the exotic and the new, and she gave it both. Her stories about being a temple dancer were fiction, but they were believable because she believed them herself when she performed. The myth allowed her to reclaim control, to decide how people would see her, at least for a moment. In a world that dismissed women as decorations, she turned decoration into power. But the gift of illusion is also a curse. Once you master it, people begin to forget there's anything behind the curtain. They stop seeing the person and see only the story. By the time she was famous, even she sometimes struggled to remember which parts of her life were true and which were creation. The stage bled into the world, and the mask fused to her face. That same illusion both saved and destroyed her. When war began, the same qualities that had once made her adored, her independence, her glamour, her access to powerful men, became reasons to suspect her. Every border she crossed, every conversation she had, was twisted into evidence. What had once been charm became espionage. The tragedy was not that she betrayed her country, but that her country betrayed her by turning her story against her. After her execution, her legend took on a strange kind of symmetry. She had spent her life pretending to be larger than life, and in death, the world made her exactly that. People could not stop talking about her. They argued over her guilt, her beauty, her lovers. They called her dangerous, brilliant, reckless, doomed. Each word added another layer to the myth, until the real woman was hidden somewhere deep beneath it, still, silent, waiting. Today, scholars dig through archives searching for her truth. They read her letters, study her trial records, and try to map her emotions through ink and syntax. But the deeper they go, the more they realize that the truth is not simple. Mata Hari was both sincere and strategic, vulnerable and strong, truthful and deceptive. She was human, and that perhaps is why she continues to fascinate. If she could speak now, perhaps she would smile and say, "You still don't understand. It was never about deception. It was about survival." And maybe she would be right, because behind the myth, behind the legend, there was always the same quiet heartbeat, the sound of a woman refusing to disappear. Every legend leaves traces, and the traces Mata Hari left behind are as haunting as they are beautiful. They exist not just in archives or museums, but in the collective imagination, in the way people still speak of her, half in awe, half in sorrow. It's strange how a woman condemned by her own time has become immortal in ours. Her life, once used as a moral warning, now feels like a mirror reflecting the same questions we still struggle with today, about freedom, judgment, and the stories women are allowed to tell about themselves. Her letters, written in a hand both graceful and deliberate, reveal more than any testimony could. In them, she writes of loneliness, of the longing to be understood, and of her dream to create something lasting through her art. "I have never done anything wrong," she once wrote, "but sometimes life has a way of painting you in colours you didn't choose." She believed she would be acquitted, that reason would prevail, that her name would one day be cleared. Even as the world turned against her, she still trusted in its fairness. That faith, gentle and tragic, might have been her last illusion. Decades later, when historians reopened her case, they found the records incomplete. Evidence missing, files altered or destroyed. What survived was a portrait of contradictions. The German telegrams naming her as H21 contained inconsistencies. Her supposed secret codes were likely fabrications. Even the French intelligence officers who condemned her could not agree on her guilt. It was as if her entire trial had been built not on facts but on fear. The fear of a woman who had refused to be controlled. The world of espionage in 1917 was chaotic, improvisational, full of double agents and false identities. Many men in her position were quietly reassigned or spared. She alone was paraded before the press. It is telling that the same newspapers that once printed her portraits with admiration now published her death sentence with satisfaction. They needed her to fall because she had once soared too high. Her execution was not justice. It was theatre. The last performance of a woman who had lived her entire life on stage. Over time, her image transformed from villain to victim, from temptress to martyr. Modern historians describe her trial as one of the clearest examples of gender bias in military justice. They note how often her beauty was mentioned in official reports, how frequently her lovers' names were used as proof of guilt. No man was ever executed for being charming, yet for her, charm itself became the crime. In the decades after her death, the French army quietly admitted that there had been mistakes in her case. But by then, history had already chosen its version. Her innocence, though acknowledged in whispers, was never officially restored. The woman who had danced to capture hearts had become a symbol of injustice, a lesson written in smoke and silence. Still, perhaps that is why she endures. The world may have condemned her body, but it could not bury her story. It lives on in every person who has ever been misunderstood, in every artist who has turned pain into beauty, in every woman who has refused to apologize for her existence. When people say her name now, they no longer speak of guilt. They speak of courage, the courage to be seen, to live vividly, to demand more from life than survival. Mata Hari's dance may have ended in a courtyard at dawn, but her rhythm continues in the hearts of those who still believe that to live freely, even for a moment, is worth any cost. Time has a way of softening what was once sharp. The fear, the anger, the accusations, they fade, while the fragments of beauty remain. That is what happened with Mata Hari. The decades that followed her death peeled away the layers of propaganda, revealing something quieter beneath, a human story. She was no longer just the spy who betrayed France, nor the goddess who bewitched kings. She became something simpler, more profound, a woman who dared to invent herself in a world that punished invention. When her case was revisited in the mid-20th century, scholars found that her so-called espionage amounted to little more than rumour. Many of the secrets she was accused of sharing were already public knowledge. Others were irrelevant to the war effort. Some of her letters even showed that she had tried to help France, not harm it. She may have played with both sides, yes, but so had countless others, many of them men who were quietly forgiven. What made her different was not her actions, but her visibility. She had shone too brightly, and the world had decided it was time to dim the light. The fascination around her never fully disappeared. Each new generation found something different in her story. In the 1960s, as women's voices grew louder across the world, she was reclaimed as a symbol of defiance, a reminder of how easily confidence could be mistaken for guilt. Feminist writers described her not as a spy, but as a woman condemned for living too freely, for stepping beyond the boundaries drawn by others. She became part of a larger conversation about gender, power and perception, about how society loves to celebrate women's beauty until that beauty begins to challenge authority. In films and novels, she continued to transform. Sometimes she was portrayed as a romantic figure, undone by love, sometimes as a cunning agent who knew exactly what she was doing. Both versions told more about the people creating them than about the real Mata Hari. Perhaps that is why she fascinates still, because she refuses to be contained. Every generation builds a new mask for her, and behind every mask she remains ungraspable. In a museum in The Hague, a single surviving photograph captures her essence more honestly than any myth. She sits quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm but knowing. There is something in her eyes, not arrogance, not fear, but awareness. It's the look of someone who has seen both sides of human nature and chosen to stand her ground anyway. Those who study her often ask why she didn't run when she had the chance, why she faced her trial and execution with such composure. Perhaps she knew that fleeing would not save her name. Perhaps she understood that dignity was her final form of rebellion. History remembers her as the woman who didn't flinch, the one who faced the firing squad with her eyes open. There's a peculiar kind of immortality in that image, a silhouette against the morning fog, poised and unbroken. She could not control what they said about her, but she could control how she met her end. And that choice, to remain unbowed, is why, more than 100 years later, people still whisper her name. In the end, Mata Hari's greatest act wasn't the dance, the intrigue, or even the myth. It was the refusal to surrender her selfhood. She had been many things in her short life: daughter, wife, mother, lover, artist, accused traitor. But through it all she remained her own creation. The world may have written her story in ink, but she lived it in flame. History, when it looks back at people like Mata Hari, often forgets the quiet spaces between the famous moments, the pauses, the small breaths that made up real life. Before she became the legend, before the headlines and the trial, she was just a woman searching for belonging. That part of her story, though less dramatic, holds its own quiet gravity. It reminds us that behind every myth there is always a heartbeat, and behind every scandal, a person simply trying to find her place in the world. In her early years in the Dutch East Indies, long before she became Mata Hari, Margaretha Zell wrote letters filled with wonder and homesickness. She described the heavy scent of tropical flowers, the heat that clung to her skin, the way the sea shimmered like molten glass at sunset. For a while, she believed she'd found happiness. Her husband's military position promised stability, and the exotic setting made her feel as though she had stepped into another world. But as months passed, the paradise revealed its cracks. The marriage turned bitter, the loneliness unbearable. She began to understand that love, like beauty, can sometimes be a kind of illusion. Fragile, glittering, impossible to hold. It was in those humid, restless years that the seed of Mata Hari first took root. Surrounded by cultures she didn't fully understand, she began to reinvent herself through observation. She watched local dancers tell stories without words, their gestures sacred and deliberate, and something inside her stirred. It was not just fascination, it was recognition. Movement, she realized, could say what language could not. When she returned to Europe years later, she would carry that realization with her like a secret key. Paris gave her the stage, but Java had given her the script. Every sway of her arm, every turn of her head was rooted in something she had once seen under the eastern sky. Yet she never claimed it as her own invention. She understood that art was a kind of translation, the act of transforming experience into expression. When she danced, she was translating her own life, the joy, the loss, the longing. Audiences saw mystery. She felt release. Perhaps that is why her performances seemed so alive. They weren't mere acts of seduction. They were confessions disguised as ritual. Beneath the layers of silk and jewellery was a woman trying to make peace with everything she had survived. The movement that looked like a lure was often a form of mourning, but the world did not want to see sorrow in her, only spectacle. It is strange to think how something so personal could be so misunderstood. Her art, born from pain, became the very reason she was later accused of deceit. The same imagination that once made her adored turned her, in time, into a suspect. In that irony lies the essence of her tragedy. The qualities that made her remarkable were the same ones that condemned her, and yet, even knowing how it would end, one senses she would have lived no other way. Mata Hari was drawn to the light, to the gaze of others, because for her it meant existence. To be seen, to be known, even briefly, was a form of salvation, and perhaps, in the end, that is why her story endures. We remember her not only for what she did or did not do, but because she embodied a truth that still resonates, that to live vividly, even for a short while, is worth more than a lifetime spent unseen. As time carried her legend into the modern world, Mata Hari's story began to evolve beyond the woman herself. She became a symbol not only of mystery but of transformation, an enduring metaphor for how identity can be both armour and vulnerability. The line between truth and invention blurred so completely that even those who studied her most carefully found themselves chasing shadows. What fascinated people was not what she did, but how she dared to become something new in an age that punished reinvention. In a sense, Mata Hari anticipated the modern idea of self-creation, the ability to craft one's own image and live within it. Long before social media or celebrity culture, she understood that persona could be as powerful as reality. Her costumes, her gestures, her carefully chosen silences, they were tools of authorship. She wrote herself into existence, one performance at a time. To her audiences, she was exotic, untouchable, larger than life. To herself, she was simply surviving, turning imagination into income. But identity built on illusion comes at a cost. The more she became Mata Hari, the less room there was for Margarita. The woman behind the myth grew lonelier as the legend expanded. Friends described her as charming but elusive, generous yet guarded. She was surrounded by admirers but rarely confided in anyone. There was always a wall between her and the world, thin as silk yet impossible to cross. When the war came, that distance became dangerous. The very qualities that had once protected her, her mystery, her beauty, her international connections, now marked her as suspicious. In a time when nations were dividing and paranoia ruled, ambiguity was a crime. The same government that had once invited her to perform in its grandest theatres now watched her through the narrow lens of fear. Every letter, every conversation, every ticket stamped at a border became a potential accusation. And still, she remained poised. She continued to write, to travel, to dream of returning to the stage. In her mind, the war was temporary, but art was eternal. She once told a journalist that to dance is to speak with the soul. Perhaps that is why she refused despair, because somewhere inside her, the music had not stopped. When the soldiers led her to the courtyard that final morning, she carried that same quiet strength. People who witnessed her death later said it was as though she stepped into a performance she had already rehearsed. She didn't plead. She didn't cry. She met the eyes of the men with rifles and gave them the same calm gaze she had once given an audience before the curtain rose. In that moment, she was once again the master of her own narrative. Afterward, as her story spread through the world, it began to change shape. Some saw her as a spy, others as a martyr. But what endures is the image of her final act, a woman standing in the morning mist, unflinching, meeting history's judgment with grace. That image became her redemption, proof that dignity can outlive disgrace. More than a century later, her story still speaks to those who have ever felt misunderstood, misjudged, or misnamed. It reminds us that the world may decide what to call you, but only you can decide how to stand. Mata Hari did not win her freedom, but she claimed something far rarer, a legacy that no verdict could erase. She left behind not answers, but questions. And perhaps that is why we still return to her, searching, as she once did, for the truth hidden behind the mask. The legend of Mata Hari, like all legends, is a reflection of the people who tell it. Each retelling reveals more about the storyteller than about the woman herself. For decades, men in power used her image to warn against female ambition, painting her as a dangerous seductress whose charm could unravel nations. Later, artists reclaimed her as a muse, a symbol of mystery and sensual independence. And in more recent times, she's been revisited as a study in injustice, a reminder of how easily society can destroy what it does not understand. Yet between these versions lies something truer, quieter, the story of a human being who lived through extremes of love and loss, fame and fear, and still found a way to face the end with peace. In the years after her death, France struggled to come to terms with its own wounds. The Great War had left millions dead, cities in ruins and faith shaken. It was easier to bury blame in a single name than to face the vastness of collective grief. Mata Hari's trial had given the nation a simple villain to hate, a convenient story that made chaos feel explainable. Only later, when the wounds began to heal, did people begin to wonder if the woman they had condemned had simply been a scapegoat for their pain. Her personal belongings, a few letters, jewellery and photographs, were scattered after the war. Some were lost forever, others sold to collectors who treated them like relics of a fallen saint. Each fragment told a different part of the story. A faded photograph captured her smiling beside a window, sunlight soft across her face. A letter to her daughter carried tenderness and regret, written in a tone both maternal and resigned. "Perhaps one day," she wrote, "you will know who I really was, and not only what they said about me." That hope, fragile and trembling, still lingers between the lines. The 20th century's shifting moral landscape gave her legend new meaning. During the Roaring Twenties, she was celebrated as an icon of freedom, a woman who had lived without apology in an age of restraint. In the post-war decades, she became a symbol of the cost of misunderstanding, of the way fear can silence truth. And in our time, she stands as something more nuanced, not an idol, not a warning, but a reminder of how complex a single life can be when viewed through the prism of history. Artists have continued to find inspiration in her paradoxes. Dancers reimagine her movements, not as gestures of seduction, but as expressions of inner strength. Filmmakers frame her as a woman trapped by the stories told about her, fighting to reclaim her voice. Writers use her as a metaphor for the masks we all wear, the faces we create to survive in a world that demands performance. Her life, though brief, still ripples through art and culture like an unanswered question. Perhaps what keeps her alive in memory is that sense of mystery that never fully dissolves. She remains suspended between worlds, guilty and innocent, real and imagined, woman and myth. That duality draws us in because it mirrors something we recognize in ourselves: the longing to be seen, the fear of being misunderstood, and the desire to control our own narrative. In one of her final letters she wrote, "The day will come when people will know that I was innocent." Whether that day has truly arrived is debatable, but innocence, in her case, may not have been the point. What she wanted was understanding, not to be absolved, but to be seen clearly as she was. And perhaps that clarity can only exist now, through the distance of time, when her story is no longer about guilt or virtue but about humanity. In the quiet after so many retellings, one truth remains. Mata Hari was not only a spy, a dancer, or a martyr. She was a mirror, reflecting back the fears, desires, and contradictions of the world that created her. There is a strange calm that comes when time finally softens the edges of a tragedy. What once felt like scandal turns into myth, and what once was myth becomes memory. Mata Hari's story has lived through each of these transformations. More than 100 years later, her name no longer belongs to a courtroom or a newspaper headline. It belongs to the quiet, to the realm of reflection, where truth and imagination meet. The world no longer argues whether she was a spy or a saint. It simply listens to what her story still has to say. In many ways, Mata Hari's life was a map of the human desire for reinvention. She had been born into a modest family in the Netherlands, lived through the fall of her father's fortune, a broken marriage, and the death of a child. By all logic, she should have disappeared into the folds of history, another woman lost to circumstance. But she refused. She turned her pain into performance, her heartbreak into art. In a time when women had so few choices, she built her own stage. That act alone was revolutionary. Her dancing wasn't about seduction in the way the press described it. It was about storytelling. Her body spoke what words could not: grief, endurance, and the search for identity. The Parisian elite saw mystery and danger, but what they were truly witnessing was transformation. A woman reclaiming her power in the only language she had left. The veils, the music, the ritual movements, they were all part of her prayer to be reborn. When war came, that language was no longer understood. The same qualities that once made her fascinating, independence, allure, confidence, now made her suspect. The men who had once applauded her began to whisper her name with contempt. To them, her power was no longer enchanting, it was threatening. Every movement, every journey, every lover became a line in an accusation. And still, she remained poised. She walked into the storm as though it were another performance, trusting that the truth would reveal itself before the final act. It never did. After her execution, silence followed, but the silence didn't erase her. It preserved her. Over the years, her legend began to glow again, not with the light of infamy, but with empathy. People began to see in her story the outline of something universal, how society builds its idols and then breaks them when they dare to step beyond expectation. She became, in that sense, more than a woman. She became a question. How much of our judgment of others is shaped by fear? How easily do we confuse independence with danger? The rediscovery of her case files in the late 20th century only deepened that question. Historians, reading through the fragile pages, realised how thin the evidence truly was, how her fate had been decided before the trial even began. The real verdict had been written not in ink, but in culture. A woman too bold, too visible, too unwilling to bow. And so she was sacrificed to preserve a myth of order. Yet despite it all, Mata Hari's essence survived. The world that condemned her has long since vanished, but her image still moves, not in the old photographs, but in the imagination of those who hear her name and wonder who she truly was. She remains both question and answer, both shadow and light. If you look closely at her story, you can almost hear her whisper across time. They made me a symbol because they could not make me disappear. And in that whisper lies the quiet triumph she always sought, to be remembered, not for what the world decided she was, but for the courage it took to become herself. In a small archive in Paris, tucked between files of forgotten war records, lies the final remnant of Mata Hari's life, her handwriting still looping and elegant after more than a century. Scholars describe the experience of reading her letters as almost intimate, as though she were still performing, her words moving like silk across the page. In her own script, she never once referred to herself as a spy. Instead, she wrote about longing, about art, about the strange way life had carried her from innocence to spectacle. Her letters are filled with contradictions, hope and despair, pride and vulnerability. But most of all, they reveal her unshakable belief that she was more than the story told about her. When the French government released her files to the public, the world discovered not a villain but a woman caught in the machinery of history. The so-called evidence of her betrayal amounted to gossip, circumstantial coincidences, and coded telegrams that could easily have been fabricated. Her accusers relied more on her reputation than on fact. Her beauty, her confidence, her travels, all became weapons turned against her. To them she was not a person but an idea, the dangerous woman. It was easier to condemn a symbol than to understand a human being. What makes Mata Hari's case so haunting even today is how familiar it feels. Societies may change, but suspicion of women who defy their roles often remains. She lived at a time when a woman who used her mind and body freely was seen as a threat. Her confidence was mistaken for deceit, her independence for immorality. The men who judged her could not imagine that she might live without needing their protection, and so they made her the enemy. But history has a way of returning to those it wronged. As the 20th century unfolded, her image transformed again, this time by women who saw in her a reflection of themselves. She was no longer a cautionary tale. She was a symbol of resilience, of the right to define one's own story. Writers began to speak of her as one of the first modern women, someone who understood before her time that identity is not given but created. The veil she wore on stage was no longer a disguise but a metaphor, the thin fabric between who we are and how the world chooses to see us. In this new light, her life feels less like tragedy and more like prophecy. She showed that a person can live many lives within one, that reinvention can be both art and survival. And though she paid the highest price, she achieved something extraordinary. She made the world remember her. There is a quiet strength in that. Every retelling, every performance, every whispered mention of her name reclaims a piece of her truth. She wanted to be eternal, and in a way she succeeded. Her dance may have ended in 1917, but its rhythm continues, soft, distant, steady. Perhaps that is her true legacy. Not the scandal, not the trial, but the endurance of a story that refuses to fade. She reminds us that identity is fragile yet powerful. That illusion can sometimes hold more truth than the facts used to destroy it. And so, every time her name is spoken, every time her image flickers across a screen, Mata Hari lives again. Not as a spy, not as a sinner, but as a woman who turned even her downfall into art. There is something almost poetic about the way Mata Hari continues to reappear in every era that follows her. She's like a reflection that changes shape with the light, mysterious, impossible to define, yet always familiar. The deeper people look into her story, the less certain they become of what is true. Perhaps that uncertainty is the essence of her immortality. Facts can be forgotten, but mystery endures. And Mata Hari was, above all else, a master of mystery. What's striking about her life is how modern it feels. She understood the power of image long before the world was ruled by photographs and fame. She knew how to turn attention into currency, how to transform curiosity into control. Her costumes, her gestures, her silence, each was a kind of language. In a century defined by politics and war, she used performance to carve out freedom where none was meant to exist. Even her name was a spell, Mata Hari, the eye of the day, a sun that could both reveal and blind. Yet behind that brilliance lay the same fragility that haunts all performers. The stage lights fade, the applause ends, and silence arrives like an old friend. In that silence she remained Margarita, a woman who wanted to be loved, who wrote to her daughter, who missed home, who feared loneliness more than death. Those letters, the ones discovered long after her execution, show a gentler side that history often overlooks. In one, she wrote, "Everything I have done, I did to feel alive." It was not a confession. It was a plea for understanding. That yearning to feel alive, to matter, to be remembered, connects her to every generation. Artists, dreamers, and outsiders have always recognized something of themselves in her. She lived in a time that demanded obedience, yet she chose expression. She lived in a world that punished complexity, yet she refused simplicity. That defiance, even when it led her to ruin, was its own kind of victory. The photographs that survive of her are both haunting and hypnotic. In some, she gazes directly at the camera, unflinching, unreadable, aware of her power. In others, she looks away, caught in a softer moment, almost childlike. The contrast captures the duality that defined her life: strength and vulnerability, confidence and sorrow, illusion and truth. Every image feels like a question she's still asking the viewer. Do you see me, or do you only see what you want to see? As the decades have passed, that question has not lost its power. In a world now obsessed with identity and image, her life feels prophetic. She anticipated a culture built on performance, on the tension between authenticity and artifice. Her tragedy was not that she was misunderstood, it was that she was understood too late. Only after her death did people begin to see that the woman they condemned was not the villain they imagined, but the reflection of their own fears. Today, when historians speak her name, they do so with respect. She is studied not as a spy, but as a symbol of female agency, of myth-making, of the thin line between fame and condemnation. In art exhibits, her veils are displayed beside her letters, as if to remind visitors that she was both performer and person, illusion and truth. Her story is a reminder that history does not only record facts, it records emotions. The world remembered her not because she was guilty, but because she was unforgettable, and perhaps that, in the end, was the real secret she carried, that even in death, she could not be erased. The legacy of Mata Hari often feels like a mirror held up to the human fascination with stories that blur the border between truth and imagination. Over the years, her name has become less of a person and more of an idea, one that travels easily between centuries. The spy dancer became a shorthand for the dangerous woman, the seductive enigma, the beautiful deceiver. Yet if you peel away the layers of performance and propaganda, what remains is not danger, but humanity, a life lived with audacity, framed by misunderstanding. It is remarkable how her story still captures people who have nothing in common with her world. Schoolchildren read her name in history books, artists reference her in music videos and fashion editorials. Her image, The poised figure draped in jewels, the calm eyes that conceal entire lifetimes, continues to appear in new forms, each generation redrawing her silhouette. That is the nature of myth. It survives by changing. In the 21st century, Mata Hari feels more relevant than ever. We live in an age of constant reinvention, where identity itself has become performance. Social media turns lives into stages. Every photograph, every post becomes part of a self-created myth. Mata Hari was doing that a century before it had a name. She understood that perception could be power, but she also learned how fragile that power could be, how easily admiration turns into accusation. Her downfall reminds us that society has always struggled with women who refuse to stay predictable. Independence can be celebrated when it entertains, but feared when it challenges. She was punished for breaking boundaries that were invisible yet rigid, boundaries of class, gender, and propriety. What made her guilty in the eyes of her world was not treason, but transgression. Still, what draws us to her today is not her death, but her defiance. She met judgment with grace, faced death with poise, and lived her brief life with intensity that few dare to match. That unbroken posture at the moment of her execution has become one of history's most haunting images. It's more than a scene of tragedy. It's an act of authorship. In choosing how she would die, she reclaimed ownership of her story. No court, no headline, no accusation could take that away from her. The real question her life asks us is not whether she was guilty or innocent, but whether truth can ever survive when wrapped in spectacle. Her story was twisted to fit the fears of her time, just as stories today bend to fit ours. But beyond all distortion, something in her remains pure, a quiet insistence on self-definition. Many historians say she was doomed from the start, that the role she invented, the mysterious Eastern dancer, the worldly courtesan, could only end in tragedy. But perhaps tragedy was not the point. Perhaps she knew, even subconsciously, that her name would outlive her body, and if so, she succeeded beyond measure. Now, when we speak of her, we do not speak of defeat. We speak of legacy, of a woman who danced through the noise of judgment and left behind silence that still echoes. We speak of someone who built a life out of imagination and dared to live inside her own invention. And maybe that is why she endures. Because in every age, there are still people who recognize her story within their own. People who have learned that to live truthfully in a world obsessed with appearances is, in itself, an act of quiet rebellion. The longer one studies Mata Hari's life, the more it begins to resemble a parable, not about espionage, but about perception. Her story is less the record of what she did, and more a reflection of how the world chose to see her. That is what makes her so enduring. She embodies the tension between appearance and truth. Even now, her image flickers between admiration and accusation, between light and shadow, between what she was and what she represented. She became the myth she created, and in doing so, she revealed how easily myth becomes reality. In her lifetime, she was seen through many lenses: a muse to artists, a lover to generals, a curiosity to journalists, and a danger to governments. Yet none of these identities truly belonged to her. They were projections, shaped by the desires and fears of those around her. The real woman, Margarita Zell, often disappeared behind the fantasy. Perhaps she allowed it, because it gave her control, or perhaps she simply grew tired of trying to be understood. In either case, the world saw only what it wanted to see. A woman who lived as freely as men, and for that reason alone, was judged as dangerous. After her death, society reinterpreted her again. Some cast her as the eternal seductress, a cautionary tale wrapped in silk. Others saw her as a symbol of feminine strength, punished for her independence. The truth, as always, lives somewhere in between. She was neither entirely victim nor villain. She was above all human, flawed, brilliant, reckless, and resilient. What is extraordinary is how her name continues to surface whenever the world struggles with the same question she once embodied. When people debate the price of fame, the illusion of authenticity, or the ways women's stories are shaped by male imagination, Mata Hari's shadow reappears. She stands as a reminder that every performance, whether on stage or in life, comes with a cost. In some sense, she was ahead of her time, living in a world not yet ready for her kind of freedom. She spoke openly of love and pleasure, treated her body as her own, and travelled alone when most women could not. Those choices, ordinary by modern standards, were radical in hers. They frightened people because they represented something they could not control. And when the war came, that fear turned lethal. Her trial was not just about espionage, it was about morality. The courtroom became a theatre where male authority asserted itself over female defiance. She was condemned not for what she knew, but for what she symbolised. The power of a woman who refused to apologise for her life. That is why her execution still feels symbolic. It was society's way of silencing what it could not yet understand. Yet history has a habit of restoring voices that were once erased. Today, Mata Hari's story is told differently, with empathy, with curiosity, and with the recognition that she was a product of her time, but also far beyond it. Modern historians now speak of her as a woman trapped between eras, caught in the storm of progress and prejudice. She danced not just for audiences, but against the constraints of her age, and in that dance lies her immortality. For while her body was taken by the earth, her story continues to move, shifting, evolving, refusing to be still. The legend lives because it speaks to something timeless, the human desire to be seen for who we truly are, even in a world determined to turn us into something else. If there is a single thread that runs through Mata Hari's life, it is the tension between freedom and consequence. She lived as if the rules that bound others did not apply to her, and perhaps, for a while, they didn't. The same imagination that allowed her to reinvent herself also blinded her to the danger of existing outside convention. In that sense, her story feels less like history, and more like a lesson written in motion, a reminder that to create yourself is an act of courage, but to live as that creation requires constant balance. Long before her name filled newspapers, Margareta had already been practicing the art of transformation. As a girl, she learned to read people the way others read books, to sense what they wanted, to mirror it, to become the version of herself that made them comfortable. This ability, born from necessity, would later become her gift. She discovered that identity could be fluid, like dance. One movement could change the meaning of an entire story. Paris was the perfect stage for such fluidity. It rewarded illusion, it celebrated reinvention. There, she could be anyone, and she chose to be someone unforgettable. Her transformation into Mata Hari wasn't only theatrical, it was emotional. Each performance was an act of self-rescue. The veils and gestures that enchanted audiences were ways of reclaiming control in a world that had taken it from her. People saw sensuality. She felt survival. They applauded what they thought was seduction. She was exhaling the weight of years spent silenced. That duality, between what she expressed and what they perceived, followed her until the end. When war arrived, the same qualities that once made her adored turned dangerous. Independence became suspicion. Beauty became evidence. Her international connections, once a source of admiration, now looked like a web of deceit. Every letter she sent, every conversation she had was twisted into proof of guilt. She did not realize until too late that her greatest talent, the ability to live between worlds, would also be the reason both would reject her. In her defense, she claimed that she had never betrayed anyone. "I have loved too deeply to betray," she said. Whether or not that was true almost doesn't matter. What mattered was the performance of guilt that others projected onto her. The image of the treacherous temptress was too powerful to resist. In condemning her, They reaffirmed their own sense of order. She became a vessel into which an entire nation poured its fear, its grief, its failure. What makes her story resonate even now is how easily it could happen again. Change the costumes, replace telegrams with headlines, and the pattern remains the same. Society still loves to raise women into symbols, then punish them for what those symbols represent. We still struggle to separate truth from spectacle, humanity from narrative. Yet in spite of all that, Mata Hari endures, not as a victim, but as a symbol of reclamation. Her myth, shaped by misunderstanding, has become a kind of liberation. The same world that once erased her now celebrates her. She has outlived her judges, her accusers, even the nations that once defined her as a threat. And in doing so, she has proven something profound, that freedom, once claimed, cannot be executed. It survives in memory, in art, in the quiet persistence of a name whispered through time. Mata Hari, the eye of the day, still burning, still bright. Every time a generation rediscovers Mata Hari, it seems to find in her a new version of freedom. To some, she is a rebel, to others, a victim of circumstance, and to many, an artist whose stage simply happened to be the world. Her life is proof that memory is never static. It bends and reshapes itself depending on who is doing the remembering. And perhaps that is why her story feels endlessly alive, because she continues to reflect our own struggles with identity, power, and perception. The fascination began long before historians tried to clear her name. Even in the 1920s, long before her innocence was reconsidered, women in Paris would imitate her style. The draped fabrics, the smoky eyes, the languid movements that spoke of confidence and self-possession. They called it the Mata Hari look. It wasn't just about fashion, it was about attitude, the quiet insistence that a woman could exist as more than what society demanded her to be. In that way, she had become larger than her own story. Decades later, her image found its way into pop culture, in novels, ballets, and even operas. Each retelling carried the same question. Who was she really? The spy, the lover, the deceiver, or the dreamer? The truth was that she was all of them, and none of them. She had lived in the blurred space between myth and memory, where contradiction becomes character. Perhaps that is what she wanted all along, not to be understood, but to be unforgettable. In art exhibits across Europe, curators began displaying her alongside photographs of early feminists, film stars, and revolutionaries. Her veils, her letters, her trial documents, they formed a strange kind of mosaic, part performance, part evidence. Visitors would stand before them in silence, drawn not by scandal, but by empathy. They saw in her eyes the eternal human longing to be seen and believed. For all the noise that surrounded her life, it was that longing that defined her most. The deeper one studies her, the clearer it becomes that she was neither saint nor sinner, but something far rarer, a woman who refused to be simple. The world wanted her to fit a single narrative, the guilty or the innocent, the lover or the liar, but she existed in the spaces between those words. She was a reminder that truth can be complex and that people are always more than their labels. It is ironic that, in the end, her most powerful act of rebellion was silence. At her trial, she did not shout or weep. She spoke calmly, answered plainly, and accepted her fate with composure. Her restraint was not submission. It was control. She denied her accusers the drama they wanted. Even in defeat, she refused to perform their version of her. That refusal is what gives her story its quiet strength. Today, her name is no longer synonymous with treachery. It has become a symbol of allure, artistry, and resilience. Mata Hari, once a label meant to shame, now evokes fascination, a kind of luminous defiance. The dancer who was executed for being too free has become a patron saint of self-invention. Her myth, once used to condemn her, now protects her legacy. And maybe that is her final triumph. She could not control the narrative written about her in life, but she shaped the one that would endure after her death. Every retelling, every film, every performance brings her back to life, not as the world's most famous spy, but as the woman who taught the world that to live boldly, even for a moment, is to defy time itself. There is a certain serenity that surrounds Mata Hari's story now, as if the chaos of her time has finally settled into understanding. Her life, once a storm of scandal and speculation, has become something softer, almost meditative. People no longer speak of her with outrage, but with a kind of melancholy admiration. The further she drifts from her century, the clearer her truth becomes. She was not a symbol of betrayal, nor merely a victim of circumstance. She was, in the simplest sense, a woman who longed to live fully, and whose defiance of limitation became her destiny. Looking at her through the lens of time, one sees not just a single story, but the overlapping layers of a world in transition. She lived in an age where art, politics and gender were colliding. Old empires were collapsing, new ideas were being born. She was caught between them, belonging to neither. The Europe of her youth, with its strict codes of behaviour, its rigid hierarchies, was giving way to something uncertain and restless. And in that moment of flux, Mata Hari appeared like a spark, too bright, too fleeting, too easily blamed for the fire she did not start. Her life reminds us that people are often punished for embodying the very change their world secretly desires. She represented liberation, sensuality, curiosity, all the things her contemporaries secretly longed for but dared not embrace. And so they admired her by night and condemned her by day. She became both fantasy and threat, worshipped and feared in equal measure. That contradiction, more than any accusation, sealed her fate. Yet in the irony of history, the same qualities that doomed her became the reason she is still remembered. The performance that once made her infamous now makes her immortal. The name that once symbolized treason now symbolizes courage. Time, it seems, has rewritten her story with the compassion her century denied her. It's easy to forget that Mata Hari was only 41 when she died. Her legend feels older, grander, eternal, as if she lived a dozen lifetimes compressed into one. She'd been a child of comfort and a wife of violence, a mother, a wanderer, a dancer, and finally an accused spy. Few people experience that much transformation in a single existence. Perhaps that is why her story continues to fascinate, because she lived every possible version of herself, even when it cost her everything. There are moments in her letters that feel almost prophetic. "I shall not live long," she wrote once, "but I will live as I please." It is a line that captures her essence, not arrogance, but acceptance. She knew the world would never understand her, and she chose to live anyway. That decision, made quietly, is perhaps the most revolutionary act of her life. When modern audiences watch films or read books about her, they often expect intrigue and espionage, but what they find instead is poetry. The story of a soul that refused confinement. Her dance, her laughter, her silence before the firing squad, all were part of the same choreography, a movement toward freedom. And so, as history re-examines her life, she stands not as a figure of scandal, but as a reminder of endurance. The woman who once stood accused of deception has become a symbol of authenticity, proof that even when the world misjudges you, living truthfully can be its own form of justice. The wind may have carried away her final breath that morning in 1917, but her story has never stopped moving. It travels through time like the echo of a dance, graceful, haunting, and endlessly alive. The story of Mata Hari continues to flow through time like a river that refuses to dry. Each generation finds something different in its reflection, a lesson, a warning, or a spark of inspiration. She's become more than her life. She has become a question about how we remember those who lived too vividly. Every retelling, whether in books, films, or whispered fascination, reshapes her into something slightly new. That is the paradox of legends. They never stop evolving. In truth, much of her power lies not in what she did, but in how she carried herself. Even stripped of the myths of espionage and romance, she remains a figure of extraordinary presence. The way she moved, the way she held a gaze, the way she turned silence into something magnetic, all of it speaks to a kind of inner sovereignty. She once said that dance was her language, and perhaps that is why words have never been enough to describe her. Her life was choreography, not just on the stage, but in every gesture of defiance and grace. Historians often debate what she believed in, what she wanted from the world. But belief, for Mata Hari, was fluid, like her art. She believed in transformation, in survival, in the beauty of reinvention. To her, truth was not fixed. It was performed. She understood, long before the modern world did, that identity could be both a weapon and a sanctuary. That understanding was what made her dangerous to a society that valued obedience more than imagination. She lived in contradiction, between cultures, between expectations, between the gaze of others and the image she created for herself. And yet, she never apologized for it. That courage is what makes her story timeless. Many people survive history by blending into it. She survived by standing apart. The price was high, but the echo of that choice still lingers, defiant and unbroken. When we imagine her final hours now, it is not as tragedy, but as a moment of absolute clarity. The fog, the soldiers, the faint chill in the air, and her standing there, unmasked, unflinching. It was as if all the illusions she had ever created dissolved into that instant of truth. No stage, no costume, no applause, just a woman who had lived too fully to die quietly. That is what keeps her memory alive, the sense that she understood her own story better than anyone else ever could. The world that killed her has long vanished, but the questions she raised remain. How much control do we truly have over the stories told about us? How much of identity is performance, and how much is essence? Mata Hari's life doesn't offer clear answers. It offers reflection. Her legend endures not because she was extraordinary in what she did, but because she dared to turn life itself into art. In that sense, she is not simply a figure of the past. She's a presence that lingers wherever people fight to define themselves against expectation. Every artist who reinvents their image, every woman who refuses to be reduced to judgment, every person who chooses authenticity over approval, they carry a trace of her. More than a century after her final bow, she still dances, not on stages, but in imagination. The eye of the day has become eternal twilight, a place between truth and myth where she continues to move, graceful and untouchable, and in that endless motion she remains what she always was, not a spy, not a sinner, but a story that refuses to end. The more one studies Mata Hari, the clearer it becomes that she was not simply a woman ahead of her time. She was a woman outside of time altogether. Her choices, her confidence, her defiance of convention seem just as radical now as they did more than a century ago. It is as if she existed in the space between eras, reaching toward a world that had not yet learned to understand her. That may be the reason she continues to feel alive, because in every age there are still people like her, living at the edge of what is allowed. In her photographs, the line between person and performance almost disappears. The camera, invented to capture truth, could never quite capture hers. There's something elusive in her eyes, not seduction, but awareness. She looks directly into the lens, as though she can already see the future staring back at her, dissecting her, reinterpreting her. That calm gaze held steady through the decades feels like an act of quiet defiance. I know what you think you see, it seems to say, but you will never truly know me. That unknowability is what has made her eternal. For all the scholars, artists and filmmakers who have tried to define her, she slips through every definition. Each attempt to possess her, through narrative or image, only proves her independence. Even now, when her story is told with empathy instead of judgment, she maintains her distance. Her power lies in that mystery, in her refusal to be fully understood. It's easy to forget how brief her life actually was. 41 years, less than half a lifetime. Yet she lived more than most people do in twice that span. From the quiet streets of Leeuwarden to the glowing salons of Paris, from the tropical heat of Java to the cold cell in Saint-Lazare, every place she touched seemed transformed by her presence. There is a strange symmetry in that journey. She began as Margarita, an ordinary girl, and ended as Mata Hari, a name that would outlive empires. In the end, perhaps her real genius wasn't in dance or espionage, but in storytelling. She turned herself into a narrative, one so compelling that history could never let it rest. The tragedy of her death only amplified the legend, but it was the life before that gave it meaning. She lived with intention, even when the world mistook it for recklessness. Her life was a performance, yes, but it was also a declaration that identity belongs to the one who dares to define it. Today, when her name appears in headlines or exhibitions, it no longer carries the sting of accusation. Instead, it carries reverence, a recognition of complexity. She is remembered not for the scandal, but for the symbolism. A woman who refused to be silent, who understood that mystery is not deception, but protection. The last century has given her what her own could not: fairness. The files that once condemned her now exonerate her. The stories that mocked her now celebrate her. Yet even with all the truth finally revealed, the mystery remains, like a faint perfume that lingers long after its source is gone. Perhaps that is as she would have wanted it, to remain untouchable, half shadow, half light, to be remembered not for what the world did to her, but for how she moved through it, graceful, fearless, unforgettable. When people today speak of Mata Hari, they often do so with a strange tenderness, as if she were both myth and memory, both cautionary tale and muse. More than a century after her final breath, her name still glows faintly in the collective imagination, surrounded by the haze of candlelight and the echo of distant music. Perhaps this is what immortality really looks like. Not marble statues or history books, but a quiet presence that refuses to fade, a feeling that lingers in the spaces between truth and invention. The mystery of her life continues to draw historians and dreamers alike. Every few years, someone publishes a new biography, claiming to have uncovered the real Mata Hari. Yet, inevitably, each portrait contradicts the last. One paints her as a tragic romantic, another as a calculating survivor, another as an accidental spy caught in a web of politics. The inconsistency is telling. It suggests that the real woman, Margareta Zell, was too layered to fit into a single frame. She lived too many lives, and the world has spent a century trying to sort them into neat categories that do not exist. In that way, she mirrors the age we live in now. The 21st century, with all its noise and exposure, is built on performance. People curate their lives, create versions of themselves for public consumption, and live between the real and the represented. Mata Hari did all this before anyone had a word for it. She understood how identity could be both truth and theatre, how self-expression could be both liberation and danger. She was, in every sense, a prototype of the modern myth, the kind born not from gods, but from the gaze of others. The fascination with her final moments only adds to that myth. Writers describe the fog that morning, the glint of rifles, the way she refused the blindfold. Some swear she blew a kiss to the soldiers before the shots rang out, though others say she simply smiled. The details may never be certain, but the emotion behind them is. Her calm was not arrogance, it was acceptance. She knew that fear would not change her fate, but dignity might change her legacy, and it did. When her name was finally cleared decades later, it wasn't through miracles or secret revelations. It was through time. Time, that quiet and patient judge, allowed the anger to fade and the truth to surface. France eventually admitted that her trial had been unfair, that evidence had been exaggerated, that she had been more a scapegoat than a traitor. But by then she had already won in a different way. She had become an idea, untouchable, eternal, redefined by those who came after. Artists began to use her image as a symbol of misunderstood women throughout history. Writers saw in her the reflection of every person punished for being complex. Dancers invoked her as a spirit of reinvention. Even psychologists studied her as an example of projection, of how easily society can mistake its own fears for someone else's flaws. It's a strange kind of justice, perhaps, but justice nonetheless. Her accusers are forgotten. Her name remains. The men who condemned her have no monuments, no whispers, no mystery. But the woman they sought to erase continues to dance, not on any stage, but in memory itself. Maybe that was her plan all along, to be remembered not through power or victory but through presence, to become a story that could never be fully possessed, and in that she succeeded. For as long as there are people drawn to mystery, to resilience, to beauty that defies control, Mata Hari will still be there, watching from the dusk between history and legend. The further the years stretch from Mata Hari's lifetime, the more she becomes a prism through which we see ourselves. Her legend bends the light of every generation, reflecting our questions back at us, about truth, gender, justice, and the human hunger for story. She lived in a time when mystery was both a luxury and a danger, when a woman's ability to captivate could make her powerful, but that same power could swiftly turn her into prey. What makes her story timeless is how little that paradox has changed. In the modern world, she would have been a phenomenon. Social media would have adored her. The exotic imagery, the daring costumes, the quiet, knowing eyes. She would have crafted her own narrative, turned her art into a global brand, and shaped the myth with her own hands. And yet, even now, she would still be controversial. The same qualities that made her extraordinary, her independence, her complexity, her refusal to apologize, would still provoke both admiration and suspicion. That is the truth at the heart of her legend. The world has always struggled to decide what to do with women who cannot be controlled. Historians now agree that the charges against her were built on desperation rather than fact. France, weary and humiliated by the war, needed a villain. The evidence was vague, the testimony contradictory, but she was foreign, she was famous, and she was easy to blame. Her trial was more theatre than justice, an echo of the very stages she once commanded. The irony would have made her smile, for once again the world had turned her life into performance. What redeems her story now is not truth alone, but perspective. Time allows us to see her as she truly was, a complex creative soul trying to survive in an unforgiving era. She wasn't a hero or a martyr, but something more ordinary and more human, a person searching for purpose, for beauty, for meaning. That is what makes her story endure. It is not just about espionage or tragedy. It's about the human desire to be seen and understood. The name Mata Hari has become a symbol for countless things: seduction, secrecy, transformation. Yet beneath those associations lies something simpler, the quiet strength of a woman who refused to be erased. Her courage was not loud, it was steady. Even when stripped of everything, she maintained composure. Even in her last moments, she chose how to meet the gaze of history. That choice, to die on her own terms, turned her from a condemned woman into an icon. Today, her legacy continues to ripple through art and culture. Her name appears in films, fashion, music, literature, invoked whenever someone challenges the boundaries of identity or dares to live unapologetically. And while many have tried to define her, none have succeeded entirely. She belongs to no one now, and perhaps that is her greatest victory. There's a haunting beauty in the way her story ends, not with closure, but with continuation. She remains even now in that space between understanding and wonder, between the known and the imagined. History may have once fired bullets at her, but the legend walked away unharmed. Mata Hari will always be more than the sum of her myths. She's not merely a figure from the past, but a living question. How much of who we are is performance, and how much is truth? And as long as that question matters, her eyes, calm and defiant, will keep watching us from the pages of time. A century has passed since Mata Hari faced the firing squad, and yet her presence still lingers, like a fragrance that refuses to fade. Time, which erases so many names, has chosen to keep hers alive, not as a curiosity, but as a symbol. When people speak of her now, it is not with accusation or pity, but with fascination and respect. She has become one of those rare figures whose life transcends fact, whose story feels less like history and more like art. Perhaps that is the truest legacy she could have hoped for, to be remembered not for what she was accused of, but for what she represented, the courage to live freely in a world afraid of freedom. What remains most striking about her is how she faced the impossible. To live as she did, on her own terms with no safety net, in a time that punished women for independence, required a kind of bravery that few understood. Her art was not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was an act of survival. Every dance was a translation of her soul, every costume a disguise that revealed more than it hid. She lived through beauty, because beauty was the only language that could hold her truth. And though her performances ended long ago, the spirit behind them continues to echo. The myth of Mata Hari endures because it speaks to something universal. We all build versions of ourselves, searching for meaning in the gaze of others. We all long to be seen, yet fear being misunderstood. She turned that longing into theatre, into movement, light and story. And in doing so, she gave it form. Her tragedy was not that she performed too well, but that the world could not distinguish performance from person. They condemned the character and forgot the woman, and yet, in the long silence that followed, something remarkable happened. The woman they silenced became the voice of every person who has ever been misjudged, every soul punished for refusing to conform. Her legend grew not from power, but from endurance. Like a dancer's final gesture suspended in air, her memory lingers in defiance of gravity. She has outlasted her executioners, her accusers, even the empires that once ruled over her story. What they destroyed in flesh, she preserved in spirit. In recent years, artists and historians have spoken of her not as a spy, but as a storyteller, someone who understood, instinctively, that life itself is performance. Her greatest act was not deception, but creation. She turned existence into art and made even her downfall a part of that art. In her death, she achieved the immortality she once sought on stage. To stand before her photograph today, to meet her gaze through the sepia haze of time, is to feel something deeply human. You sense both the cost and the grace of her life, the pain of misunderstanding, the strength of resilience, the quiet pride of someone who refused to look away from the world even when it turned against her. There is no bitterness in her expression, only clarity, the look of someone who has seen both cruelty and wonder and accepts them as equals. And so her dance continues, not on stage, not in a courtroom, but in the collective memory of those who still whisper her name. Mata Hari, the eye of the day, remains luminous, a reminder that beauty can be defiance, that art can outlast judgment, and that even in the face of death, grace is its own kind of victory. In the end, she achieved what she always wanted. She was never forgotten.